Hi everyone, I'm the Rambling Photon, and today I want to talk about pragmatism versus idealism and how I view the interaction between the two, and I think the right balance that I try to strike with these two concepts. So, going off what I talked about in my last video about logic and value and emotion, we're going to start off with a setup. We have a machine with two inputs. So we have inputs A and B. These inputs are going to be, first, our emotional and value statements, our emotional and value premises, if you will, and the other will be reality, data, and facts. And these will go into the machine of logic, which will then output a conclusion. Now, if you use broken logic, you get a bad conclusion. If you use bad emotions or values, then you will get a bad conclusion. By the view of somebody else. If you use incorrect data and incorrect facts, then you will get an inaccurate conclusion, a conclusion that does not match reality. So we don't really have a purely, we don't have an infallible connection to reality. So we can sort of cross that out. We can say we don't know reality. We're going to do our best, though, to use data and facts that we can determine as best we can determine to input into our logical machine to get the best conclusion we can. Now, ideology and idealism is going to influence our emotions and our values. So when something doesn't match up with our ideology and it offends us for whatever reason, that's because it's going against the emotional core, our value core. It goes against our core values, if you will. Now, the problem is when we allow our ideology to influence facts. So if we allow our ideology, instead of purely influencing our core values and our emotional responses, but instead we let it color which facts we pick, that's a problem. Alternatively, we can also have ideology break our logic. So you can get issues of this where you use your ideology to make non sequiturs or to make other logical fallacies and just brush over those problems rather than specifically rejecting data or rejecting other people's emotions. Okay? So ultimately, what happens is there's going to be a feedback loop. So our emotions and values, along with the data and facts, go into this logic machine, our logical process, and we get a conclusion, okay? Now, we will be able to assess the conclusion in terms of our values and emotions, okay? So there's sort of a metric here, which is based in our ideology. Okay, so the conclusion is going to influence our emotions, and how we interpret the conclusion is going to be viewed through the lens of our emotions and values. And when we do that, we generate a feedback loop. So you get the conclusion influencing your emotions and values, which change what you put into this logical machine. Okay. Also, after you put this stuff into the logical machine, it gets a conclusion. We can test that against our data and facts. And so tests can feed back from our conclusion into giving more data and facts. And this can be used to check to make sure that our logic is working or to make sure that our data and facts are correct. Now, one of the problems with idealism is we start off blank. We don't use data and facts. We are just going to be using our core premises. When somebody's an idealist, we might call them naive or something similar. And this is not inherently a problem. I think it is important to have in our mind's eye the ideal situation in a counterfactual scenario. Okay? So instead of just valuing purely based on emotional responses to facts, we should have a conception of what our ideal world should look like if we had the option of making up whatever data and facts we want, right? So what does the ideal system look like? Okay. Now, pragmatism, what we're trying to do is we're allowing the data to influence our emotions and values so that we can have a check on our emotions and values. And this is how I view pragmatism. It's putting data to use to get the outcome that we desire, right? So what that means is if we look at data and facts And it turns out that the actions and conclusions that we've been taking have not been giving us what we want. It means we need to change either our metric, so either our emotional value metric for what we want, or we need to lower our standards. We need to change something in order to achieve what it is we want. Okay. It can be a tactical thing also, using the data and facts to influence which actions we take to maximize our values. So let's take an example. So let's look at my ideology. So my ideology, I have a core value of self-ownership, and this is simplifying it a little bit because I don't want to have to get into all the nitty-gritty details, but sort of a general overview. I believe in self-ownership, non-aggression, and private property. Okay. Now, private property is sort of derived from the idea of self-ownership. We can get into some of the nitty-gritty details on that, but let's not for now. So these are my inputs. I put them into my logic machine, and ideologically and ideally, so ignoring facts completely in this case, what do I get? I get ANCAP, anarcho-capitalist. Okay, so the idea being that there is no government in the sense of a government that uses aggression to take wealth from people and do other things with it. Capitalist in the sense that I think that private ownership of property is the way to go rather than communal ownership of property, because I think that you are and should be entitled to the fruit of your own labor. Okay. Now, this is my ideology. I am inclined ideologically, and these are my ideals. My ideal world looks like Ancapistan, if you will. Now, let's temper that. So, unfortunately, we don't live in the world where Ancapistan is possible, at least as far as I can tell. Now, if we had the best facts ever, then of course we could still do this, right? But I don't know if that's actually accurate. I don't know if that will actually match the world, okay? So let's discard those, okay? So we're not going to deal with our ideal facts, because that's just letting our core values and influence what we take as fact. So let's discard that. So using actual facts, is ANCAP viable? Well, I don't know, okay? So it's something that I will not dogmatically cling to because of pragmatism. So is ANCAP viable? Well, we've never really truly seen something that would match what I would think of as the ideal, so not yet, okay? So maybe there's a theory that ANCAP ideas break down as the size of society increases. So it might work for small communities, but it might not work for civilizations as large as ours. And is that possible? Maybe. I don't know. We'll find out. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add pragmatism and add this feedback. So we've never seen an ANCAP society truly perform without some sort of government interference. Okay. So that feeds back into, I'm not going to be able to perfectly hold to my values. Something has got to give. So what am I willing to change in my values to match the facts that we have never ever seen the ideal world that I envision? Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change from non-aggression to minimization of aggression. Okay. So rather than saying that no aggression should ever happen ever, right? That doesn't match reality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let aggression become my metric for evaluating conclusions. Okay. What I want is I want to minimize aggression. Okay. So now that leads to not ANCAP, but minarchy, or what is sometimes called minarchy. Okay. So the minimum size of government possible. Now, the way I think about it is I want to have the system which minimizes aggression. If a government is required to do that, I am not going to necessarily be against that government. Okay. If you can demonstrate to me that without it, then my society's aggression increases. So if you have a state that does in fact minimize aggression, then I will advocate for that. If we can demonstrate that it is not necessary for there to be a state, then I will advocate for that if that does indeed minimize aggression. So that means in general, I will be advocating against increasing the size of the state because I consider the state to be aggressing against its citizens when it acts, okay? But it might be the least of all evils. I am not opposed to that idea, so it could be that the state is a necessary evil, but I will still acknowledge that it is evil, okay? So once I apply that metric, once we use our ideology to, instead of determining a hard and fast set of rules that cannot shift and cannot change based on the facts, if instead what we do is use our ideology to set up a metric by which we can judge the outcomes of different actions and different takes, I guess, different attempts at government, at things, right? Then that is where it's useful, right? So that is, in my opinion, the ideal, because we are taking our ideology and we are tempering it with pragmatism. We are using pragmatism to maximize our output of our values. So they're the people who dogmatically cling to their ideology and they don't let facts or logic or any sort of feedback influence them. And I think that's where you get the worst of the dogmatism. But then you'll also get people who never define their own metrics or their own values. And that's a problem, because if you're trying to accurately describe reality, that's not a problem, okay? Reality doesn't give a fuck about what you think. Reality doesn't give a flying shit about how I think about it or how you think about it. So when you're examining reality, it can be fine to have no defined values. But when we're talking about our action, I think we need to acknowledge those values, as I talked about in my last video. And once we are able to do that, then we can properly apply pragmatism, in the sense that, again, pragmatism without any core values is just telling you what's going to happen when you do a particular thing. You need that metric in order to say whether that thing you're doing is good or not, is better or worse than whatever your target happens to be. So you can apply this framework to other things like free speech or other freedoms generally. So in terms of free speech, do you ever want to censor somebody because what they say will discourage others from speaking? And you have to define your metric and then stick to that metric. Most free speech folks use the metric of, if the speech does not directly incite violence, then we're keeping it. And that's it. So the free speech absolutists sort of hold that particular position. Some of the SJWs, like ContraPoints, will take the other position that there is some speech that, because it discourages other people from speaking, it should not be protected. So this is a very simplified setup and very simple inputs. Of course, in actuality, all of your inputs of values are going to be very, very complicated and numerous, and similarly with all of the facts that are relevant to any given situation is going to be numerous. This is a very simple view of all of my principles and premises, and obviously I didn't put any actual facts into this diagram. Again, because reality doesn't give a fuck about my feelings. Reality can throw facts at me and I'll need to adapt and change based on those. And the more core values you add, you're going to get conclusions which you're going to have to evaluate. It gets a lot more complicated. You can get far more complicated just because the number of premises and values you can add is basically infinite. It's only constrained by your patience. As long as you define what the core values are, and as long as you can correctly identify the correct facts, you can use this framework for basically anything. So those are some of my thoughts on idealism versus pragmatism. If you like my content, like, share, subscribe, all that shit. I've been the Rambling Photon. Hope to catch you next time.